also oftentimes misunderstood. The exact definition of empathy and the components included are hotly debated in the literature, so it makes sense to first clarify what we mean by empathy before we get into any further into it. Oh, wow. So on a fundamental level, empathy is the response of a person to the emotional experiences of another person. And it consists of a cognitive and an affective component, the understanding and the sharing of another person's emotional experiences. Both components have to occur in tandem for it to be empathy. Cannot stress that enough. And then I personally agree with definitions which add a behavioral component. So my simple...
Do you have slides that should move?
No, not yet. God awful. Especially after looking at Andrea's slides, you will be disappointed. Anyhow, my simple working definition of empathy would be to understand, share, and respond with care to another person's emotional experiences. Empathy can theoretically be elicited by any emotion, from joy and excitement to pain and sadness, yet most studies and people in general tend to focus on the pain and sadness part. And while the emotions of the empathizing person and the person being empathized with should be convergent, of course, they don't have to be exactly the same with the same intensity. It will be exhausting to feel other people's feelings with the same intensity as your own. And also, how do we know what exactly another person feels? You're not the same human. It's always an approximation. You should do your best. It doesn't have to be exact. In psychology research, empathy is thought to emerge from the interaction of trait and state influences. Trait influences are kind of stable individual capacities and attributes, and then state influences are specific conditions arising from a situation. Empathy is malleable, which makes it prone to training or empathy-building interventions. Fingers crossed, very soon we will publish a systematic review and meta-analysis of empathy-building interventions and their effectiveness. Watch out for that. It's going to come one day. Why do we care about empathy? It contributes to fostering positive social interaction. It is vital for building and maintaining relationships. And it's been consistently related to various pro-social behaviors, sharing, helping, community volunteering. It also reduces stereotyping. It increases engagement with people perceived as distant or dissimilar. So yeah, empathy has long been recognized as an avenue to foster connections between humans that has more recently been suggested to connect human and non-human beings as well. Research has shown that people can extend empathy to non-humans, with the main focus being on animals. And empathy with non-humans leads to pro-environmental behavior, like better treatment of animals and donation to environmental NGOs. Empathy is not just found in humans. Expressions of empathy have been observed in animals, such as dolphins, apes, corvids, elephants, and rats. And even for them, it's a main motivator of pro-social behavior among each other. Now it should move, and it does. Now that we settled this, what empathy is, this is the agenda for today. I'm going to talk at you for 30 minutes, and then we have all the time in the world to have the question session. And I will start off with a very in-depth rationale of my project. I spent the entire first year of my PhD reading empathy theory and writing an essay about it for my comprehensive examination, which is a milestone exam in a Canadian PhD. I'm not sure if you guys do that. It's all right. I will explain the thought process behind my project, which was rather emergent, as you say. My original PhD position that I applied for had nothing to do with empathy, but things change and I like where I am in my journey at the moment. So this is nice. And then next up, I'll show you an overview of my proposed studies. I've written a classic proposal. I can send it to you if you care. And I feel very confident about my first study, which is great because I'm in the middle of it and mostly done with data collection. Then the other two studies, I don't feel so confident about. So that's where you come in, because I will ask you questions. And then last, we will talk about my first study in a bit more detail. Data collection went well, if I may say so myself. And I've also had a great time doing my fieldwork, so I just like to talk about it. Yeah, and then lastly, I have questions for you, and you can have questions for me if you want to. So, empathy is predominantly studied in psychology, neuroscience, and health sciences. And it is mostly studied using quantitative approaches, experiments in controlled environments. And I didn't engage all that much with these fields of research before starting my PhD. And so when I looked at a classic psychology paper with the eyes of a sustainability something, I was so confused. Those are two very different research traditions with differing methodologies and onto-epistemologies and core assumptions. And one thing that confused me is that empathy is mostly assessed or measured using so-called psychometric scales, which consist of a number of statements where you have to rank your agreement to that statement on a scale of 1 to 5, or something like that. If you wish to scan this QR code, you will go to a pretty standard psychometric scale, the empathy quotient, and you can test your empathy or just see what I'm talking about. I score fairly low on this and similar tests, which is funny or infuriating, I don't know. But as an example of one of the statements in this questionnaire, we have seeing people cry doesn't really upset me. That is so vague. That can mean 1,000 different things. Who's crying? Why are they crying? What's going on here? It could be anything from a toddler throwing a temper tantrum because they can't have ice cream for breakfast, to like a cheating ex-boyfriend who's lying even in tears. Not all crying warrants me being upset. The context matters here. But empathy measures tend to be very general and focused only on the individual without taking the context into account. Which is weird for an inherently other-oriented phenomenon that kind of presupposes a connection to another person or being. You're not empathizing in a vacuum, but with someone in a specific situation. We do have slightly different psychometric scales, which measure people's empathic response to a stimulus. Let's say you're reading a letter from the perspective of a homeless person who describes how it feels like to be in their situation. Then you have context, that's nice. But the issue remains that you can just say, yeah, I empathize, I understand and share, and be confidently wrong. Also, rating your feelings of empathy on a scale of 1 to 5 is great for stats, but it kind of glosses over any nuances, and our feelings tend to be quite nuanced and complex. And I don't want to dismiss classic empathy research, who am I to do that? And there's nothing wrong with using quantitative approaches to study empathy. I'm just mentioning these critiques in air quotes to explain to you how I arrived at how I wanted to study empathy, which is in part a reaction to reading classic research and thinking, there's something missing. Actually, reading through this rich body of literature is super fascinating. Empathy research really took off in the 80s, but it's been studied for decades before that. And there's a huge variety of topics and approaches and community studies. We have statistics based on large participant samples, and we have insights in neuroscience showing us which neurons fire in which region of the brain when we experience empathy. So it's pretty remarkable. But as a sustainability science person, of course, I was interested in how our field or fields of study look at empathy. And it's a lot. It's mentioned all the time. I added, I think, too many examples to this slide to drive home that point. May I read to you? Empathy has been described as a key quality of a transformative project leader in sustainability science contexts, a bridge across disciplines engaged in the pursuit of sustainability, key interpersonal competence for sustainability scientists, a relational value, a facet of emotional connections to nature, and an inner leverage point able to foster transformations in human and human nature relationships. We got it all. There also is quite a well-cited paper describing the so-called empathy sustainability hypothesis, where the authors state that empathy is a prerequisite for sustainable interactions with the environment, and that analyzing empathy for human and non-human beings alike can generate significant insights into potential solutions for today's challenges. And of course, that sounds amazing, but what all these papers have in common is that they don't engage with a body of literature from psychology and neuroscience and health sciences. They just mention empathy as if we all agreed on what that is and what that means. And in the rare cases that we find work that tries to integrate knowledge from both fields, it's always theoretical and never empirical. If you find a paper that does that, send it to me. And I understand why people don't do it. It's not easy to reimagine empathy in the sustainability sciences, which are oftentimes concerned with transdisciplinary, place-based, participatory approaches and multiple scales and complexity and relationships. very different from empathy research. But I really like combining things that have no reason to be together. I like productive friction. I like working with contradictions instead of trying to smooth them over. And this is not my first rodeo, as they say. In my master's thesis, I combined computational text analysis, topic modeling specifically, with creative futuring methods and science fiction storytelling. That wasn't simple or straightforward, but at least it was interesting. I hope we have a similar experience. So how did I go about integrating empathy in sustainability science? I looked into research on relational thinking to conceptualize an empathy that was fit to be applied in sustainability science. And then I looked into research on inner transformation to situate empathy in our body of literature and see how empathy could support sustainability outcomes. For the relational concept of empathy, I drew on work by Simon West and colleagues on relational thinking, and Tilman Hertz and colleagues on process ontologies. They proposed a shift from stable entities as base units of analysis more to processes and relations, which better capture the dynamic and complex and intertwined nature of social ecological systems. That does get pretty philosophical, which I think you can tell from this extremely sophisticated graphic. And I won't go in depth about this today, but by framing empathy as relational, we shift our focus away from the individual to the context, to the web of beings that the individual is in relationship with. And there is literature on relational empathy already, oftentimes in studies of nursing or therapy, and there empathy is described as a continuous engagement with and attunement to the emotional experiences of another. It's more of a co-creative practice facilitated by the openness, trust, and responsivity of both parties. And this type of empathy requires critical reflection and oftentimes correction and revision as you learn about the experience of the other. It's more of a process. You may not think empathy as a co-creative practice facilitated by the responsivity of both parties. How would that work with a dandelion? And that is quite esoteric, I give you that. And of course, it is easier to empathize with humans. You can use language to communicate if you speak the same language and just ask about their experiences. But if you have a pet, for example, you do get to know them. You get to know their personality, you build a relationship, and eventually you will know what they feel and experience. It does get a little trickier with plants or whole ecosystems, as they don't have emotions or inner worlds in the same way that we do. But there is research describing empathy with plants based on Max Scheler's theory of embodied empathy. And the logic here is that mind and body aren't separated. Our inner experiences are embodied in expressions and behaviors, and those can be perceived and then empathized with. So for plants, plant growth or flowering or the leaves wilting and hanging down provides a basis for empathy with plants because it tells you about the plant's state of being. And this shift in focus to processes and relationships helps us to move beyond this kind of binary of empathy with humans and empathy with plants as two different things, which is great if you want to integrate empathy into sustainability science, which is oftentimes concerned with social ecological systems in which humans and nature are understood to be intertwined. I ended up naming my little construct social ecological empathy, and empathy with intertwined more than human assemblages. And because this form of empathy emerges from relationships, from interactions, it's not just a cognition or an emotion that you experience here in your mind, it's accompanied by actions, by expressions of this empathy, which again is great for sustainability science, which is most often problem-centered and action and solution-oriented. I'm less interested in empathy as kind of an academic truth or a fact or something. I want to know how it can be put to work as a tool to change our lived experiences for the better, ideally. I'm not super sure about the term social ecological empathy. I mean, it shows you who I'm trying to appeal to, but it's not that catchy, so maybe we can workshop that. In a second step, I wanted to situate this construct in sustainability science to have a bit of a theory of change, air quotes, to how empathy may contribute to sustainability outcomes. And there are multiple kind of overlapping frameworks. which stress the importance of intra and interpersonal dimensions of sustainability. In the interest of time, we're going to speed run through this as well. But the idea, and I think you know that, of these frameworks is that in order to radically shift current trajectories, technological or economic solutions may not be enough. We have to engage with the root causes of unsustainability, which are thought processes, worldviews, beliefs, values, relationships, paradigms, all that. And a change in the inner worlds of people can lead to tangible change beyond the individual. It's kind of a precondition of a change of the larger system. The idea is kind of, we cannot change the intent of the system without changing the intent of the people who then perform that system. In the leverage points framework, for example, shifting mindsets and paradigms is understood to be a deep leverage point, like the deepest, I think. The 3 spheres of transformation framework stresses the relevance of the personal sphere. The inner development goals, goals for personal development in support of the SDGs, list empathy as one of their core skills. And I love this cute little sign, so I got it tattooed, so that's fun. This work on the intra and interpersonal dimensions of sustainability is a great entry point. Kind of integrate empathy into sustainability science, and it also kind of cements the need to engage with psychological constructs. We keep talking about inner worlds and being quite vague about it, so it would be nice to look into, psychology. Before we move on, we're done with the theory now. Let's do a quick recap. Social ecological empathy, a relational construct consisting of cognitive, affective, and behavioral components. It is context dependent, it's embodied, practice-oriented, and the theory of change is that by cultivating social ecological empathy, we can recognize and deepen our relationships with human and non-human beings, thus supporting sustainability outcomes. While I am fairly sure that the basic feeling of empathy is universal, specific expressions of empathy that are considered empathic and appropriate vary across cultures. And so if you want to explore empathy in a way that is culturally appropriate and sensitive to all the nuances and complexities that empathy has to offer, it makes sense to focus on a particular social ecological system. And in my case, that is the Canadian province of New Brunswick, marked in red here. It's a little 15-hour drive northeast from where my university is located, and it's a very rural province. 83% of it is forested, income levels are among the lowest in the entire country, and it's sometimes stereotyped as being a bit behind hillbillies. I spent 7 months there, and I am in love with the place and the people. It has spectacular nature. I've seen moose and a bear in the wild, which is wild. And I am collaborating with an environmental NGO, namely the Conservation Council of New Brunswick. The idea being that I want to design a project that is tailored to and thus effective in the local context. My plan was to talk about how I established this collaboration, since I had no prior contact to New Brunswick. I just showed up and tried. But in the interest of time, again, let's talk about my actual studies. And if there's time in the end, or time at the next coffee break, we do it then. Let's get into the meat and potatoes of this. The objective for my first study is to gain a comprehensive understanding of social ecological empathy, of course, in the context of New Brunswick. It's great that I read all this theory, but it's interesting to know if that is relatable or of relevance to real people, specifically environmental stewards. And I chose to work with stewards because you can probably guess that they have a close relationship to nature and thus have experienced empathy with human and non-human beings. That's a hypothesis, not a fact yet. And I mean stewardship in the widest possible meaning of that term. The idea is not to show that it is possible to feel empathy with a non-human being. That's already been done. The idea is to get into the finer details of how that comes about and how it manifests in practices. And then with this knowledge in mind, for the second study, I want to design an empathy building intervention to build socio-ecological empathy in the general public. And my first idea was to do like a tabletop role-playing game a la Dungeons and Dragons as the intervention. And I still love that idea, because role-playing as a participatory arts-based method tends to open up safe spaces in which people can explore and imagine and reflect on their relationships with human and non-human beings. And participants would create a character through the eyes of which they would experience the world for the duration of the game. That is a prime example of perspective taking if I've ever seen one. And then they would also engage with the other players of the game and their characters, possibly building empathy among them. My problem is that I'm unsure whether I can actually pull this off. Like, can I design a role-playing game? I've never done that before. I'm also unsure how I would get people to participate in a study that may as well take like 10 to 15 hours of their lives. So I'm not sure who wants to do that. And then in the first study, no participant ever mentioned art or imagination. They talked about direct engagement with nature and sensory experiences. So would it be smart to kind of shift the entire thing and design an outdoor workshop focused on the senses? Yeah. Then the third study is even more chaotic. My plan was to design an evaluation tool to measure changes in empathy following an arts-based intervention. And I don't like the psychometric scales, so I wanted to do a more qualitative tool that is still structured, still scientifically rigorous, but allows us to capture the nuances of empathy. And then I kind of wanted to use my newly developed evaluation tool to assess my newly developed intervention, but that kind of seemed like a circular thinking and also too risky. What if my intervention completely flops and then I have nothing to assess? Also, a key goal of my collaborators of the Conservation Council is to prove that arts-based interventions can have real measurable effects. They do quite a lot of arts-based work, and they have trouble getting that work funded because funders don't take art that seriously. So I guess to play it safe and make my collaborators happy, it would make sense to evaluate my intervention using established techniques, psychometric scales once again, and then find another arts-based empathy building endeavor to evaluate using my tool. Because I have no clue which intervention I could assess the impact of in my proposal, I wrote something totally different, namely that I will do a conceptual framework showing exactly how empathy contributes to inner and outer transformations. I don't love that idea because it strays away from my place-based focus to be more universal, and also it implies a year of desk research, which sounds boring and lonely. So I'd love to chat with you guys after this about this and hear your comments and critiques. Before we do that, let's talk about the study that's actually working. I went out to talk to 30 environmental stewards to learn how empathy is understood, felt, and practiced by them in their natural environment, in their everyday lives. We did a photo voice study consisting of 2 interviews that were between 30 to 90 minutes in length, and a photography exercise in which we answered the following 2 prompts. Please take pictures and moments when you experience empathy in nature or with nature. Which aspects, beings, or places do you feel empathy with? And can you imagine seeing the world from nature's point of view? If I gave the camera to nature, what would nature take pictures of? And I say we because that's a habit of mine, but also because I did this exercise myself, but on my home island where I'm actually deeply connected to the place. The idea being that it would just be fair if I'm the first person to share things and be vulnerable. I want to not feel like a researcher to participants, but like an awkward friend that they're doing this together with. And so we had our first interview to kind of set the stage. I asked about their work, their relationships with nature, what they think of empathy in a more general sense. And then they had 2 weeks to take their photographs, and then we reconvened for the second interview and discussed the meaning behind the photographs, using the photographs as a catalyst for discussion. And photo voice is quite a useful method if you want to capture knowledge that is more tacit and embodied and subconscious, which knowledge on relationships and emotions oftentimes can be. And I believe photo voice to be quite the common method at this point. What was like a revelation to me is how much my work benefited from meeting everyone in person, spending time in nature together, and building relationships. So I went hiking with lots of participants. We went early morning bird watching. I hugged a tree while praying to the Lord with a participant who works as a substitute priest and then incorporates environmental topics into her sermons. At some point, I interviewed a horse together with his companion human. We followed Herbie the horse around and noted what he focused on, his body language, his expressions. I told participants that I will come to wherever they want to meet me, and we will do whatever they want to do, which means that I drove 16,000 kilometers in 3 months, and I was covered head to toe in mud and bug bites kind of half the time. But I think it paid off, since this connection and trust is important if you want to talk about personal topics and emotions. If you want to go deeper than surface level and get to the thing that actually matters to people, which I believe we did. Also, look at their pictures. They're partially very talented. Not all are the same level, which is fair. I can't really talk about results just yet because we have a group workshop coming up next month where we will collectively analyze the data. So everything I'm telling you right now is preliminary. But, for example, to answer the question, with whom do the stewards experience empathy, one could look at the elements most commonly captured and discussed in the photographs. We have humans in the last place, with children being mentioned most often. And then plants and whole ecosystems or landscapes are pretty much tied, with trees and water bodies eliciting the most empathy. In the literature, it's still debated whether or not humans can empathize with plant life. So this is a cool finding. And then, unsurprisingly, animals are most commonly mentioned, with birds being the most prominently featured species, which surprised me. I think I would have guessed dogs. But of course, we go beyond numbers and ask what makes people feel empathy. In which situations do they empathize? With which emotions or experiences do they empathize? And what does that mean to them? What we can talk about already is challenges. This hasn't been easy all the time. It's certainly not perfect either. For example, I think it's questionable whether taking photos from nature's perspective maybe reinforces that human nature binary that we're trying to eliminate here. I've also been thinking about the dangers of projection and anthropomorphism and how much that can or should be avoided when we can't fully know what another being feels. How much imagination is needed, and then how much is too much. I have a couple of pictures I just want to show you as highlights. There's a lot of really heartwarming and also gut-wrenching stories came up. For example, here the photographer captures his father mourning the loss of the woods that he grew up in, which were recently clear-cut. And he suggests that the ecosystem may feel empathy with his father, making both less alone in their pain. That's the one interview that made me cry, by the way. I was quite surprised by the number of funny stories where humor is used to cope with tough times, make sense of the nonsensical, or express complicated emotions. New Brunswick fun fact, all the trash cans have motivational messages, like don't do drugs, stay in school, buckle up. Very iconic. And then we have participants capturing really high-level concepts in a photograph, and it's interesting that both chose solid blue to represent their thoughts. One photo shows the different scales that nature experiences the world in, like billions of years from the tiniest atom to the whole planet. And then the other picture captures energy or vibration that nature may use to perceive things. Not every being has eyes or senses like ours. The lady works with homeopathy. And you can guess which picture is which. And then you made it to the interactive portion of this experience. Here are my questions. Of course, you can ask me anything else, and you don't have to answer this. This is just what I would appreciate your thoughts on. We have what would you do as an empathy building intervention? I thought through everything from forum theater to the role-playing game to an outdoor sensory workshop. Thing is, we have to be pragmatic. What can I actually do with limited time, limited resources, and limited experience? And then I would like to know what you would do for the third study. Does an evaluation tool even make sense? Does everything need to be measured and have a measurable impact? And what about the conceptual framework? Is that feasible as one person? Or would that be participatory? Then we have, can you think of people who'd like to be involved in this? I would love to have collaborators, co-authors, new friends. Wow. And then lastly, what would be a catchier name for social ecological empathy? And is it necessary? Wow. To define a novel construct, or should I just call it empathy and call it a day? Perfect, last second. I made a thank you slide to thank the participants, even though they can't see me, and thank the Environmental Sustainability Research Center at Brock, the Conservation Council of New Brunswick, and you guys for hanging out with me. Thank you. And then not the entire time.
Oh, finally. So much, Anna. Cool. Are there any questions? Responses to Hannah's questions?
Sorry, I know there's a lot.
Yeah, in the beginning felt that your research was very interesting, just from what you had mentioned in the first beginning stage, and then hearing more about it now, it's very resonant strings. And and I'll even turn this into a question, but I'm working with humility, concept of humility, and how humility fosters exactly that in and out of transformation. And it's interesting to note that you say you're constrained by the having to still work within the very rigid framework of quantitative, or kind of what name you use, but we understand what you mean, the boxes and the that kind of research language, and something more innovative and artistic and more expressive of what we could say might empathy look like you're saying, photo voice revealed. I actually hadn't thought about how photo voice could do that, to reveal the trees and the humans and the animals, and how you then quantify that. Like you took a quality, like just a picture, and that for me that's new. I learned something today. Because at first I thought to myself, why would I use photo? And then it clears itself out. That was nice. And then the last point about your third study, and I guess you already looking at, but I thought with people that were involved or that are part of your participant group to experience, I guess they've already done it, but to experience, maybe it's not it hasn't landed.
We have time. I mean, I'm here for another month, so whenever someone has a thought, just come up then.
Okay.
I have 2 points. The one is just the reflection that, first of all, a very, very fascinating study. I think it's really cool. And in terms of the question you posed around, should you still do the game, or, should there need to be something else? I was just curious if maybe you had encountered some kind of metaphor people tended to move towards in terms of describing their feelings and their experiences. Because a similar experience we had when we were working with communities and activists from Malanga, for example, is that they kept going back to the metaphor of a train. And then what we did is, because the train was understood or used so eloquently to explain their experiences of the just transition and how they think it's this train that's just determined to leave everyone behind. They don't know who's steering it. So they built this metaphor, and instead of trying to take it back to the language we always use, we're like, let's just go with this metaphor, and we actually constructed something around the metaphor of a train, where we also did the switching perspective thing of, what if you were the conductor? What if you were a first ticket holder? What if you were a second ticket? What if you're a third one? And then people could more eloquently express themselves with a bit of removal, but also with a reference point in terms of people being able to relate to a very similar metaphor. So I wondered if maybe there was some metaphor that, or I don't know, or a common concept that people use towards that you could potentially rather use that as opposed to maybe it can be gamified, I'm not sure. And the other thing is I was very fascinated by the idea that there's so much more empathy with animals in nature than with people. And it made me wonder if a lot of the time I feel like, I don't know if it's it's a socioeconomic or global south, global north dynamic, but I've always felt sustainability literature is so concerned with nature. And it's always about, we're trying to conserve. And I'm always just like, but what about the people? So then I'm just wondering now if this, this greater connection people feel with nature is why so much of sustainability feels like it's concerned with nature. And obviously now we have to think about people because of the justice aspect. Yeah, it just made me wonder if some of it comes from that.
I can answer both. I'm very happy about that. A metaphor that people keep using and bringing up, which doesn't work in German, is to walk in someone else's shoes, which is not ideal because it's not necessarily about how you would feel in their shoes. It's about how they feel in their shoes. So that's putting yourself in their place, is kind of inserting yourself where it's not about you, it's about them. I still love the using language that people understand, like the train metaphor. And if I was doing the intervention with the same group of people that I'm doing it with now, we could lean on stuff we've discussed together, but I want to use a completely different group of people, the general public, people who haven't thought about human-nature relationships all the time. And then the second one, I have to mention, what was the second one?
The people.
I think part of it is framing, because we keep talking about what would nature take pictures of and when do you feel empathy in nature or with nature. In the first interview, I asked, do you think humans are part of nature? And everyone besides 4 people said yes. But I thought we could just say humans as the big umbrella term and humans being part of this big thing. But I suspect that maybe people took less pictures of humans because they were so in that nature, that's not a human mindset. But I still fully agree with you. We're focusing on nature as if we weren't part of it.
Did you want to respond to that?
Well, just to that question.
Okay, and then
I mean, my first thought when TK started saying that was, it's maybe also the group of people that you were working with. That group of people is a selected group, type of person, type of people that do that kind of work are generally people that love nature.
yes.
So yeah, it's not, to me, it's not
the stewards of nature.
Yeah, exactly. We're stewards of nature. That's their value system. Nature is their. So it's not like a general. It's not like a general group of people.
Based on 30 people, you can't make a final anything.
Yeah, no, for sure. But even just the sample was of a particular type of person.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for your presentation. You're quite a good presenter. Really nice. You can tell stories, which is really beautiful. And often, sometimes when it's difficult for somebody to catch up on something, but the storytelling is really, appealing. But the reason I'm responding is because you did mention whether is it possible to use gaming as an intervention to speak more about empathy. So my master's thesis was on gaming, and using that as a kind of interface for bringing together different people to think about complexity, but also to kind of have imperative discussions around what it feels to experience certain experiences. And I think there's quite a lot of games you can contextualize, most especially games where people can play different role players. For an example, you can have a counselor or a leader or a policymaker playing the role of a farmer affected by climate change or the other way around. And I'm not saying it's a space for building empathy, but it allows you to have these discussions and to reflect in a way that people are able to think differently about those experiences and what it means to relate to problems that other people often face. So maybe, and then if you need any help regarding what kinds of games are out there and how can you best contextualize them, how can you make them work in a kind of interactive, safe, participatory space, I'm more than willing to assist you with that.
That's great. Thank you so much.
So we've got a hand online, and then we've got Yolanda and Dinka as well. And
Should I unshare by Rika?
oh yes, maybe that's
Rika.
and Rika. Okay. 2 hands online actually. So we'll go Answa, and then Yolanda, Dinga, Rika, and Erica. Wait, no, Kinga.
I think Rika was before me, so
Okay.
I can go last.
Answa, please feel free to raise your question.
Thank you. I think my first thing is just to mention, I don't know if it may be of interest, but Matthew Zylstra, who's an associated with the center, wrote a PhD on connectedness of nature and meaningful experiences of nature, and his dissertation is a whole book essentially. And empathy came up a lot, so that may be an interesting resource to go through, because he wove a lot of personal experiences into it. So it's a fascinating read. So it's kind of this whole conceptual, it's a lot of conceptual academic work, and then also this personal space. So anyone who's working in that kind of area, I usually recommend reading his stuff, just as a little bit of inspiration.
Sounds great, thank you.
Yeah, so I'll send it to you. But I do warn you, it's literally a book. Please don't try and copy him. It's extensive. The follow-up question I actually would love to hear is that as I was listening with you, I did grapple a little bit on how do you keep that conceptual boundary between what is empathy, what is what people would maybe describe more as just having a moment of awe or inspiration with an environmental effect or experience. Yeah, so those concepts of awe, connectedness with nature, inspiration, all these kind of things, because they're kind of murky and sometimes overlap a lot. So I'm very curious from just like an academic perspective, how do you draw that line?
That's one of the reasons we had 2 interviews. One to really talk about what do you think empathy is, and then after they share, I also give them a definition just to make sure that we're kind of on the same page and that no one gets too far off the definition. And then people oftentimes show pictures. For example, I think this animal is extremely cute, so I photographed it, I'm showing it to you. I'm like, yeah, but is that empathy? So I just keep asking, what about this makes you feel empathy? What do you think that being is experiencing? So I just bother them until they explain it to me. And sometimes, to be fair, not in many cases, but in some cases, what people describe could, for example, be more pity than empathy. And I don't know if I want to take out their answers and say, well, this wasn't quite empathy, so I'm just going to drop this from the data. Or if I want to keep it in and say sometimes pity and empathy overlap, or beauty and empathy can overlap. I'm not sure about that yet.
Yeah, so just like thoughts. But yeah, I really enjoyed your presentation. Like Reynolds said, you're a really great storyteller. Just like from what TK said, I found that very interesting as well, but obviously then Diane put it into context, which is very important. But I was also going to say that I did write a paper earlier on this year on like how people, well, because the president of Botswana at some point said, like in a major speech, that people from the global north care more about animals than they do about like people in Africa. So there's always that interesting interplay between like empathy towards animals that you see and like, and empathy towards people who live with those animals and who interact with biodiversity and have different experiences with it. But yeah, context is so important. Like in the case of Stuart, values and everything apply. But when I was writing that paper, it was definitely like based on like people's different priorities on like how conservation should be managed. And I read a paper that was talking about how empathy shouldn't have a place in conservation decisions. And yeah, so it's super cool to see that you're doing this work on empathy, because at that point I like 100% agreed with it. I was like, okay, we can feel what we feel, but when it comes to like managing things, let's look at scientific facts on the ground and like what needs to be done, what doesn't need to be done. But I mean, I guess that's also what's been nice about being at the CST, like realizing that the world doesn't work in one scientific way and that there's so many important things like empathy and all of that. So I guess my comment is that, I guess it still is a question though, like if, like how empathy plays a role in conservation, if it should or shouldn't, and if we should like wear a different hat when we start making recommendations for policies and everything, even like from the environmental stewards' point of view, if they have to make a decision between like communities and like the environment that they steward, should they like take off their empathy hat or not? I mean, it's obviously not a straightforward question. But yeah, this thoughts that I had, but also just super cool to see that like you're doing this. And also a reminder to me when I do my research to like move from within the scope of like super quantitative literature, because then there's also this expansive literature that goes more in science. So yeah, just appreciate that.
That's so nice. And I think I read in the paper that you mean. And as with many critiques of empathy, oftentimes authors only look at affective empathy, the feelings part, and not the cognitive part. And no, it's not enough to think of like fluffy, cute animals if you want to conserve them. You have to have a certain amount of knowledge to empathize correctly. Like if you see an octopus in an enclosure and you're like, oh my god, it's lonely, I have to like get him a friend, and then they kill each other because that's not how they work. You have to know about the creature to empathize with them correctly. And you have to have the cognitive and the affective, the thinking and the feeling to make any kind of decision. And then also someone at PEX, I think, asked us in the panel, like, is empathy enough? And the answer is no. That's just one thing, and we need a lot more things. No, we can't save the world by empathy. That would be cute, but very unrealistic. But yes, I've seen those papers talking about our love for wildlife can't be enough to conserve it. I'm not sure.
Thank you so much for the nice presentation. I enjoyed it. And just to cue from your last words, if empathy with animals is enough to conserve them, I would ask, what about the people who live there and what they care about? How they survive in that area? Because some of them survive on those animals. So that's where, but I will not go much philosophical on that dimension, especially with the divisions on human nature. Some people say we are within humans and this, but what I like to say is the human nature dualism, or whatsoever people call, is like our body, right? You have eyes, you have ears, you have, all of them are part of your body, but they play different functions. So at a point in time, you can say, okay, this is how my eyes helped me. This is how my ears helped me. So it's not like you have detached them before you want to compare them, but you are conscious of the fact that each of them has a part to play. So just like humans are nature, nature plays a part and humans play a part in that whole. But one nice thing I realized with the photo voice stuff, I have I can say a colleague also who is doing something like that on gender inclusion in agriculture, and they had to buy cameras and give women in Ghana to take gender biases and stuff like that with their men and stuff like that. So it brought a lot of nice things. So I was happy to see the photo voice again now from another angle. Then on your question, I've forgotten how it was directly, but it was a question around if you need to work on a tool or something to capture empathy, which is
that would be useful, yeah, if
that
everything has to be measured.
Yes, that would be useful, maybe more qualitative or something like that. I would say it would be useful because if you don't put the tool out there, then we will have nothing to critique. And we will have nothing to start with. So you should put the tool out there, and then we should start from there now to build on. I am working on a tool as well. Yeah, I am battling with reviewers for that, well, which is more qualitative. Mine is based on wetlands, and I had to critique a lot of tools done by the Ramsar Convention. If you know, that is like the model of all wetlands. So you imagine small me trying to say what Ramsar is doing is wrong. We have to go this way. So the paper came back with 4 different reviewer comments, very diverse. some people going out of context, and I had to review it very well with the editors. But the paper is back into the review process, because I really feel it's important to get those tools out there. Just a very simple thing. Okay, what do you care about this? And then you have this measuring metrics that you feel. Any researcher can adapt to any context, and then we start refining the tool and critiquing and improving on the tool. So that's my perspective. If you need maybe some perspective or what I feel from working on a qualitative tool like that, and then we can catch each other on that as well. So,
I'm totally gonna steal the metaphor. I'm
thank
not
you.
gonna rip my eyes out before I know what I will steal that. Thank you.
Yeah. Erica, and then we'll go Rika Kinga.
Thanks, Maren. Thank you, Hannah. I thought it was a really lovely presentation. I really liked your slide on inner worlds of individuals as a site for transformation. I really like it's useful. I was just wondering, because I've been working so much on methodologies lately, about the number of qualitative methods you're using to do the different sections. So to understand if I heard correctly, you did interviews and then you doing the photo voice and now there's a question about what stays in and what do you do with it. So I was just wondering, would that be enough for you to sort of more or less say from a for the PhD perspective, or the rigor part that's going to come, that the qualitative methods are enough in every section? I mean, I just think that the challenge with the sort of work we're doing, which is about defining these intangibles. I mean, I try to work in governance, and you're working in something really challenging as empathy, which is you have to have so many ways of triangulating and showing people what you'd want to demonstrate. So I was just wondering if you had any other methods. I know you're looking at art-based methods, but any other ways of being able to position the content as well? Thanks. It's just a question.
Oh, all good. I know at heart I'm a more qualitative than quantitative person, so all the numbers stuff I'm doing for other people, and because I've heard you're supposed to do it. We did
I'm the same.
did collect demographic information from the participants of this study, so we can do some stats of who said what, even though like it didn't feel like, just as a perceptive thing, that, for example, gender or age played a role, but we can go and actually check. And then just the sheer amount of data is a little daunting. I had kind of forgotten that 60 interviews between 30 and 90 minutes is a lot of data, and I'm supposed to analyze it now, and just looking at it makes me want to cry. And then, yeah, for the second study, I hope to combine the classic psychometric scales, the quant stuff, and something artsy, and then maybe develop this tool to give people something to critique eventually. But yeah, the combination's always hard, and there's going to be people on both sides that say it's not qualitative enough or it's not quantitative enough, and just gotta battle and debate.
Yeah, the qualitative is better. I said it. Don't quote somebody else.
That's fair.
Rika.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's really amazing to hear how far you are and how you've thought through this already.
Tried.
Yeah. So I have 2 or 3 just questions. So I do think, I mean, the idea of social ecological empathy, how would that differ between human nature connectedness, which is now some kind of field of study emerging? Because all of the human nature connectedness work tries to establish some indicator of, you know, how people feel connected to nature and why, and how is the connectedness, how is empathy and connectedness different?
According to one of the big authors in the connectedness literature, Chris Ives, empathy is a facet of emotional connections to nature. Yeah. So I think it fits under the umbrella, but empathy is specific, that you really have to understand the inner world of an individual and share that experience with them to a certain extent. I think you can feel connected to someone without necessarily being as involved in their emotional lives. I mean, I can feel connected to nature here, but I have no idea what's going on. It just feels nice. I guess empathy is more in depth, and it's a very specific, interplay of cognition and emotion. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think it's a part of connection, I would say. And what is really hard to tell for me is like the chicken or the egg. Do you use empathy as a way to build connection, or would you rather be connected first and then it's easier to experience empathy? I feel like it's a bit of a how do you say, like a virtuous cycle. The more you have of one thing, the more you have of the other, the more you have of blah, blah, blah. But I think someone's going to ask me that one day, like what comes first?
And then just to think about more deeply about your relational definition of empathy. How is that different to normal empathy? Or would participants, I mean, how would you, I mean, the whole thing about the relational thing is great. All of us also want to think and write about that, but trying to figure out how to actually, come up with a criteria or a value that is mutually constitutive. Because that's really the idea of that, is that, so the value has to come from the tree and the person mutually constituted.
I see how that gets super esoteric, definitely, and I still haven't quite found a way. Yeah. The thing is, normal empathy measures only focus on how you feel. They don't check whether or not that's correct. You could be telling me an emotional story. I could understand it completely wrong and then just say, yeah, I empathize. Yeah, that works. And there are some methods where they then ask also the other person, where they kind of measure the empathy in both. Like, is that other person reacting to my, like, you would tell me a story and I would reflect back to you what I think you're feeling. And then you can say, that's right, or no, you're getting it wrong. It's like this. And so this, mutual thing I would like to capture somehow. Because I mean, it also depends on the person being empathized with. I can hide my emotions and pretend. And then it's not your fault that you're not empathizing all that well if I'm hiding my feelings. So it does take kind of two people to tango here. I don't know how we're doing that with the tree. Yeah. But I will get there, I think.
Yeah. Great. And then there's some work being done by someone also in Canada on activism, where she uses a scale which is thinking, feeling, and sensing to bring in a little bit more dimensions also of, because also people, it's very difficult for us to distinguish between thinking, feeling, and sensing, but to try and just linguistically and practically create a larger range of let's say getting data, but also allowing people, whilst you're asking them about stuff, to reflect on more different things about themselves.
And people,
quite nice, maybe.
My transcripts don't quite reflect how the interviews actually went, because people kept telling me like, oh my God, touch this horse fur that's on the ground. How does that feel to you? Can you hear the birds in the background? My transcripts are so messy because I always like put in parentheses also what we're doing. Getting lost in the woods, and then half the interview transcript is just where are we? So the senses came up all the time, and I don't know how to translate those senses to just words. That doesn't feel right because I love the idea.
Yeah,
senses will be integrated somehow.
Yes, thanks, Rika. And then maybe the last question, if there aren't any others. Inga.
I mean, now I want to go into this discussion, but because there's like so many interesting things to pick on there. But maybe instead, I mean, we can have that discussion. Maybe instead, I'm thinking more about like your pragmatic questions around, like how do you build this, your studies in this consecutive order of like, and how they build on one another. And I think I still like the idea of like for your second study of like a game, not just because, or like game or some sort of role play, not just because I think it is feasible to do that within your scope, but more you can then kind of translate everything that you learn about the empathy, and so much, and there's so much, like I've been diving into this literature as well, and it's just there's so many things, but you can like use that knowledge to kind of translate it into some sort of rule of games, to tangible things that will guide this role play or the game. So it's not only like then you possibly helping people to build empathy in that specific context, but also you kind of maybe even testing already like how that plays out in the real life, that theoretical knowledge that you have, which I think is really nice, like progression of your study. And you know, it's fun to do and probably fun for you and participants, so why not? But also, and then, because now for the study 3, you have this like, okay, conceptual framework or this kind of tool of evaluation. Like I don't know if we need more conceptual frameworks around empathy because there's just already so much. And just putting a relational language on it, like basically what Rita was kind of mentioning now, I don't know if this is so useful, I guess, especially since you're working with a stakeholder. So I would still try to stay connected to what is useful for that stakeholder. And I think you were talking about assessment tool, and in your first paper, you're going to criticize the existing tools to some extent, or that criticism is sitting with you. Yeah. So why not put the existing measures against a qualitative tool that you want to develop, and then test with that, or assess with that your own intervention and another intervention that is not yours. So then you have two tools that are independent, that they measure or assess empathy differently. And then you have 2 projects that you try to evaluate with both. So it could be quite nice to then you can like have this kind of comparative study. You can maybe evaluate the unruly as a second intervention. I don't know. But like you can, and then maybe that has a nice academic or even theoretical implications, but also then maybe it's useful for the local stakeholder instead of just having a desktop study for another year and more. And maybe then postdoc can start with a conceptual approach.
But you're right. I love the idea of the role play because if it turns out good, and again, I've never done that before, that would be a game that could be adapted. I could put this out there for free in the world and be like, whoever is bored enough to use this, please go ahead.
Next week there's a workshop with some people that we met at the conference. They're doing workshop. This is a role play, more than human work play.
I was a part of that. I was
you already did
given
that.
the role of a white tourist in South Africa. It's easy. That down.
And also maybe just a note on the photo voice, because you said like a couple of things. Like first with this, like, oh, that's humans didn't come up so much. I mean, that's certainly is the framing of the prompt in some way, and so many other things. But it also with it doesn't matter what is photographed. It matters what it means. So I wouldn't focus too much on like what is on these pictures rather than what people told you, like what it means.
And it counts what people.
So that's exactly. So that's more important, I think. And then I would also say, like, don't drop the outliers who speak about, like sympathy or pity or whatever, because that is also meaningful, especially if you do this like in-depth nuance analysis. Like otherwise, it's virtue into the quantitative mindset, I guess.
Really would like to not drop anything. That's okay.
Including your laptop.
Because I mean, there are people that were honestly just a bit confused and didn't do that well, and I still think that their slight odd opinions matter. Yeah. So I would love to actually keep everything.
And just be explicit about like what the quality of that contribution is in some way, and then.
All right. Well, thank you first for all the feedback. I think I'm keeping you too long. That was not the
but
plan.
I know there are people who need to rush off, so maybe we can go again for those who want to continue the conversation. That's more than possible. Okay, thanks so much, Hannah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I ask you outside of
Sure.
How? Because at the very beginning you said some try to measure empathy in animals. How did they do that? Because empathy is cognitive, affective. You also add behavioral component, but like so then, how do they judge empathy